Hi, I'm Hopkinton Tech Librarian Danielle, and I'm joined by our teen librarian Anne for Teen Lit Bits, a short show where we'll feature old and new teen books that are perfect for binging.
Hi, I'm Anne. Each of our 6 sessions will discuss one topic in YA Lit and should be about 20 to 30 minutes long. This session, session 2, we're going to be sharing some genre mashups you might want to read in teen lit and maybe in adult lit as well. Now, I hope you all know a literary genre is a type of story that usually shares some common characteristics. I'm sure you're familiar with a few literary genres: mystery, Western, fantasy, historical fiction, science fiction. And some of you probably have some favorites that you tend to gravitate to. But we're going to talk about a trend, especially in YA literature lately, where a lot of authors are combining genres. So it becomes kind of a genre mashup. It might be a combination of historical fiction and fantasy, or mystery and sci-fi. So they're a little bit harder to classify as just one genre or another. But I would say if you enjoy one genre, you might want to try one of these mashups, and it might actually introduce you to a new genre that you could discover that you actually kind of enjoy reading. So a few YA books lately have combined historical fiction with fantasy. So this is going to be the first mashup we're going to talk about. The first book I want to mention in this mashup is called The Lovely War by Julie Berry. And this is about several people in World Wars I and II, but it's told by the Greek goddess Aphrodite. I believe she's telling Hephaestus and Ares the story of these real people during world wars. So it also touches on the themes of love and war and how oftentimes they seem to coexist together. And then another one that just came out last year was called 13 Doorways, Wolves Behind Them All by Laura Ruby. This also combines the history of World War II, but it brings in the Depression. This is in America, the United States, and is also a bit of a ghost story. Then there's a series called The Bloods of Gods and Royals by an author named Eleanor Herman. And this is really interesting because it meshes the real story of a young Alexander the Great also with gods as well. So gods get involved with Alexander the Great and some of the other characters that you meet in the story. And then there's one of my favorite series, The Diviners, by Libba Bray, actually portrays a realistic look at the 1920s in America, but it also has some really interesting characters who have supernatural powers. There's some demons. Takes place in New York City. They're underground in the subways. They have to fight the demons. And this is actually the latest in the series. So I have yet to read this one. And you can see it's nice and thick. So that'll keep me busy for a while. But that one's good too. And you actually learn a lot about the 1920s as well as get some of this fantasy involved. So let me throw it back to Danielle because I think she has something to share.
Yeah, if you're interested in fairy tale historical fiction mashups, I also highly suggest Naomi Novik's Spinning Silver, which is a retelling of Rumpelstiltskin in a town split between Jewish and Christian in Eastern Europe before World War I. So I really enjoyed that one. I read it. It came out, I think, about a year ago. And Naomi Novik has a couple other stories that she's written, including a long series about dragons. But her Spinning Silver, I think, was the one that best embodied that kind of mashup that you're talking about, where she didn't actually name a specific town that she was writing about, but it had a very clear sense of place, and it was very historical. But then there were also fairies.
Oh, that sounds really good. And actually, that sounds like in another session that we're going to talk about fairy tale retellings. And that sounds like that could fit in that one as well. So
it could, absolutely.
Good one. All right. Let's move on. The next mashup we're going to talk about are stories that combine stories that read like realistic or contemporary fiction, but also have elements of magic realism in them. Magic realism being things that don't take place outside the realm of reality, maybe ghosts, maybe going through doors that aren't there. So and actually the winner of the Prince Award this past year, which is the highest award you can get for young adult literature, falls into this mashup category. And it's called Dig by A.S. King. And A.S. King has a lot of books out. So now Dig, I might not recommend to everybody to read, but you should just, if you are interested in seeing how this book maybe wins such a high honor, high award, you might want to pick it up. It tells the story of an American family throughout some generations, but focuses primarily on 5 teen cousins and how they end up meeting each other after years of family secrets. And one of the cousins, sadly, is a ghost. So it combines this interesting realistic fiction kind of with the teens who are living life right now in the real world, with the ghost who's trying to communicate with them, and their family history. And as I said, it won the Prince Award. So if you're interested in that, check that out. Another story that falls into this mashup category is called Pet. And this is a new author. I hope I pronounced his name correctly. Akwaeke Emezi. This is a story about a girl named Jam who is basically taught that monsters no longer exist. But one monster emerges from one of her mother's paintings. And Jam has to basically decide if she is ready to hunt this monster to save her town and family. So it raises an interesting question about, if people continually tell you that monsters don't exist, is that true? Or are there monsters that are still, and what do we mean by monsters? And then another one in this category is called The Last True Poets of the Sea by Julia Drake. And this is actually a retelling of a Shakespeare story. And this talks about Violet, who goes to live in Maine for the summer, but she needs a little bit of magic to sort of help her family get past some troubles that they've had. She has a brother who tried to commit suicide, and so her family is trying to work on that and get past that. And there's kind of a little miracle that happens in the book at some point. And that's a new author as well. That is her first book as well. And then another book that's kind of a beautiful story of the power of beauty and what does it really mean? What does physical beauty really mean? Is called Bone Gap. And this is by Laura Ruby, an author that I keep mentioning because she's so good. But this is, they live in a town called Bone Gap, and there's a gap because people seem to disappear in these gaps, and then do they suddenly reappear? What happens to them in this gap? Where do they go? Will we ever see them again? So it's kind of this magical place, but talks about some very realistic characters in this town. So that's kind of a really interesting mashup. You don't read a lot of books that fall into that category, but that is an interesting mashup. Then there's kind of a newish genre that has emerged in the past few years, and it's known as cli-fi, kind of a combination of science fiction mixed with climate change, a very topical piece here to discuss in literature right now. And they often include elements of dystopian fiction, survival stories. So one of these titles is called Not a Drop to Drink by Mindy McGinnis. And this is something where water in this new world is so scarce that it's more valuable than gold. And it tells the story of this one teenager and what she has to do basically in order to survive and keep getting this valuable resource. Another cli-fi to check out is called Shipbreaker by Paolo Bacigalupi. And this is actually a series. He's got a series that started with this. And this takes place in New Orleans, that of course is underwater because of all the melting of the polar ice caps and the icebergs. And how people sort of have to adapt in this new society and how they have to try and make a living. So as I said, elements of survival. Then there's also a series called Dustlands by Maura Young. And this is basically where dry wastelands are continuously ravaged by sandstorms. So how do you survive in that kind of new climate? And then author Sherry Smith has written something called Orleans that also portrays a world basically New Orleans again, but also sort of the Gulf Coast and the Delta, after a string of devastating hurricanes and, strangely enough, a disease called Delta fever that might have people thinking about times right now. But these have ravaged the country also. So again, how do you cope with these changes in climate, what it does to the environment, and how can you possibly learn to survive in these new kinds of situations? Danielle, I think you have something to add.
I do, yeah. So cli-fi is really big right now, both in YA and in adult literature. In fact, N.K. Jemisin, who just won a Hugo Award for each book in her Broken Earth series, which is a feat that nobody else had ever done before. But her books feature many of the hallmarks of cli-fi. She also has a new book called The City We Became coming out soon that we're all very excited about. And I think that one deals with a city that is sentient, which is an interesting spin on the kind of cli-fi, that we have the climate as a character. Now she has a city as a character. In fact, a lot of science fiction books by authors of African descent, which all fall into this genre that's referred to as Afrofuturism, deal with aspects of climate change and ecological decay. And then even broader than that, a lot of sci-fi and fantasy have used the ecology around a place to kind of comment on what's going on in the story. I mean, for example, if we go back, to J.R.R. Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings, which is one of the one of the staples of the genre, where the elves live, which is a good place, is all green and there's lots of trees and everything is lovely. And then where Sauron lives, in the mountain, it's a volcano. Nobody wants to live there. And then when evil starts to spread across the land, we get the spidrins, the gigantic spiders that kind of infiltrate where the elves live. And so this this kind of cli-fi that we're talking about, where the climate and where the ecology and where the world itself kind of infiltrates the story and becomes a character and becomes a symbol for like the sort of struggles that the characters or that we ourselves are going through, is really seminal to science fiction and fantasy. And so I think it's interesting that they're taking this just a step further here.
I agree. I hadn't really thought of it, also the climate as sort of its own character in a lot of these books. So that's a really interesting point that you mentioned. And it just reminded me of another one that had recently come out, a young adult book called Wilder Girls, by Rory Power. And this one actually takes place on an island in Maine. And these girls are in a private school. And so they're sort of separated from the rest of the country at this point, the rest of the world. But the rest of the world is unfortunately going through a bit of a climate disaster. So how can these girls survive? Can they survive? Can their island maintain a sort of a separation from what's going on in the world? And if it does, what does that mean for them? How are they going to be able to survive either on their own, or will they ever see anybody else off the island again, their family, their friends, who they don't see because they go to this private school? So yeah, these are really timely topics, I would say. So good. Thanks for that, Danielle. That was very interesting.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, this next mashup we're going to talk about is books that combine elements of classic Western with elements of horror or fantasy, like, for example, zombies. So there's a book called The Good Luck Girls by Charlotte Davis. This is also a new author who's emerging in young adult literature. And she tells a story of a group of girls who band together with the help of what's called a range man. You can sort of picture maybe a sheriff or a deputy or somebody like that, or a ranch hand. And they have to escape their fate as basically slaves. They were branded. There's another Western sort of element in there. They've been branded and were basically taken to sort of serve one sort of purpose in this new Western society. But they also have to fight ghostly beings. There are apparently some men out there who have these sort of supernatural powers, so they have to fight them too. Then there's a book called Dread Nation by Justina Ireland. And actually, I have the sequel that just came out here, which is called Deathless Divide. And you can see how on the cover they've got sort of this Western attire, Western motif there. This is about the Civil War era, but unfortunately, people who have died in the Civil War, all the battles, come back as zombies. And so it's up to people on this frontier outpost. They have to move further away to escape from the zombies. So a group of people are on this frontier outpost, and they have to basically fight the zombies in order to survive. And it's really cool because it's got a bunch of strong females who are there too to fight the zombies. Then there's also a book called Walk on Earth, a Stranger by Ray Carson, another author I have mentioned. And this features a California gold rush setting. And there's this one girl in particular, our main character, has kind of this power. She can sense gold whenever it is around her. So she can sense when gold is in the ground, when it's in the water. And you can imagine that's both a wonderful power to have during a gold rush, but also a dangerous power to have, because if others find out she has this power, they could basically take over that power, keep her with them, and use it, of course, for nefarious, evil purposes. But all of these stories combine some of these Western elements that we love to read about. Danielle, do you want to comment?
Sure. So there's a new novella that's out. So it's not a full novel. I read it in probably about 2 hours. But it's by an author named Sarah Gailey, and it's called Upright Women Wanted. And it draws very heavily on the Western genre. But it's also post-apocalyptic. It's got a little bit of like a Game of Thrones vibe in that the United States is kind of split up into a couple different segments. But the main characters are a bunch of queer librarian spies.
That's awesome. Queer librarian spies.
It is, yes, it is absolutely amazing. And I read it in about 2 hours. I picked it up, I started reading it, and I finished reading it. And it was amazing. So if you're looking for something that maybe takes you out of your genre a little bit, Western is not something that I normally read. But that still has characters that aren't just the trusty sheriff and the stock characters. That's a really good direction to go in.
Oh, that sounds really cool. Yeah, I agree. Westerns aren't usually something I gravitate to, but I found a lot of these mashups a lot more interesting because they tie in a lot of other things besides just the sort of tried and true Western motifs. So I like this particular genre mashup. I think it's really interesting the way some of these authors have gone with that.
Yeah, I think one of the difficult things about Westerns is that a lot of Westerns were written in the middle of the 1900s. And so a lot of them are unfortunately very racist and very sexist. And so it can be difficult for people nowadays, and particularly for people my age and for people younger, to read these sorts of books and be like, oh, you don't say that to a woman, though. And so I think it's a nice breath of fresh air that these authors have taken these books and kind of combined them with other genres that either don't have that stigma, or with other genres where they can kind of take that and twist it and make it a little bit more interesting.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I think too, I'm guessing, I didn't read a lot of Westerns written in the 1900s, but I'm guessing a lot of those focused primarily on male characters. And I think what's nice, especially about a lot of these YA mashups, you're getting a lot of strong female characters. So there's somebody I can identify with.
Queer librarian spies.
Yeah. And somebody that teens can identify with. So I think that's why, yeah, these are particularly successful. So yeah, I'm excited about this genre. I think it's very interesting. One final genre mashup I want to talk about today is a combination of historical fiction and one of our favorites, graphic novels. There's a graphic novel called Queen of the Sea by Dylan McConis out. And actually, I think it won a number of awards last year. This is loosely based on the lives of Queen Elizabeth and her sister Mary. So even if you're not a fan of historical fiction, I think you could read this if you like the graphic novels of Raina Telgemeier, for example. I think you might find something to like in that too. White Bird is written by A.J. Palacio, and of course she wrote Wonder. Everybody knows that story. But this tells the story of one of the characters from that, Grandmère. And Grandmère was a young Jewish girl who was hidden by a family to save her from the Nazis, I believe in Poland, I think. So this would also be interesting if you, again, like Wonder even, or Raina Telgemeier, she tells, this sounds like it combines a little bit of maybe historical fiction with realistic fiction, but told in graphic form. And there's another one that came out this past year called They Called Us Enemy. And this is by George Takei, the actor, but it's all basically a memoir told in graphic form of his experience as a time spent as a child in an American internment camp during World War II. And this one actually, I think, won a couple of awards too last year. So this, I think, would be really fascinating, especially if you liked maybe Mouse by Spiegelman, those graphic novels that dealt with World War II. But this, of course, would be on American soil. And, we were not guilt-free as far as racism and prejudice during that time as well. So, and if you enjoy watching George Takei, you might find this really interesting too, to discover something about him. So these were just an example of some mashups that you can try. Try something a little bit out of your comfort zone. See if you might like it. And stay tuned for another session coming up where we will discuss, I mentioned this before, we're going to talk about fairy tale retellings and retellings of famous stories in a new form. For example, Pride and Prejudice in space, maybe. So stay tuned for that.
You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram on the library's social media pages. Be sure to like and follow us to get notifications about all of our LitBit videos, as well as lots of other cool stuff we have. And of course, if you want more LitBits, join our YA LitBits group on Facebook for all of our videos, as well as links to our question box and fun polls.
All right. Thanks for joining us, everybody, and happy reading.